times over the past 8 years, but this is the first time Ann's let me be part of a program, so I'm thrilled.
Better be good.
Can everyone hear me? Can you understand me? It goes without saying I'm not a Cape Codder. I grew up in a farming community in Georgia, and so I have not given up my accent or my roots. My son-in-law is French, and before COVID, we all went to a relative's funeral in the South, and before the ceremony, I said to him, you may have difficulties understanding some of my relatives and the guests. He smiled confidently and said, I think I've got it licked. I watched Forrest Gump twice last night. This evening we will revisit two stories that relate to the history of Cape Cod. Since these stories were first recorded, new information has become available. It's fair to say this information challenges our initial interpretations. As students, we are taught to think critically. We are taught to distinguish fact from interpretation. We need to keep these points in mind when we study history. Actions taken in the past, stories written in the past reflect a different time, different interpretations, different biases. The objective of this evening's program is to update our understanding of history. By revisiting these stories, we hope to offer facts and interpretations that are more meaningful, more consistent with history, and more meaningful in helping us relate to the world around us today. I'm pleased to share this evening's program with Sloane Awtrey. Sloane is an independent specialist in American folk art. She has a master's in American and New England Studies from Boston University. Sloane was first introduced to American folk art while working at the Shelburne Museum. She went on to survey and research American folk art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She has co-curated the MFA's 2021 exhibition, Collecting Stories, The Invention of Folk Art. She has provided research support for numerous books, including Samuel McIntyre, Carving an American Style, associated with the Peabody Essex Museum, and Robert Shaw's 2021 book, American Weather Vanes, The Art of the Winds, which was associated with an exhibition by the same name at the Museum of American Folk Art in New York City. Sloane has recently relocated to Colorado, but she continues to work with New England objects and history. She continues to catalog for the Copley Fine Art Auction in Hingham. Please join me in welcoming Sloane.
Can you see the slides from there as I'm pointing? Can you see the slides from there as I'm pointing? I want to make sure you can see. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. I am so happy to be here with you all tonight. First of all, in person, please, in person. Yay! And secondly, and more importantly, just to share years and years of research that has led up to what we know tonight and what I'm going to share with you. And it's just a real pleasure, and thank you for the invitation from Jean and Tales of Cape Cod. All right, I'm just going to dive in. Now, can you hear me? Okay, and if it starts to buzz, I'll back off. So the series, or tonight's called History Revisited, Updating Old Stories. And that revisited is just a great term for this talk, because more and more is discovered. You'll see my little squiggle over there. More and more is discovered about an object as we return to it over and over again. And it adds more and more information. And we're trying to get down to the bottom, get down to as many facts, information about an object that can be answered. And it takes coincidence, being in the right place at the right time, patience, a lot of patience, and in many ways, a village. And that is what the case is tonight, that you're going to hear now. So tonight we are revisiting the story of this figure of justice, and that is in the collection of Shelburne Museum in Vermont, and its association with the town of Barnstable. So by the end of tonight, you'll know more about this carved figure, but also, despite all we found and are circling ever closer to the truth, we still don't have all the answers, which is what makes history and objects and museums so much fun, because it's never ending and we all just have to keep working together. And hopefully tonight, I'm going to hear maybe your sides and your stories to share of what you might know about the figure, which is why this tonight is so special to be here in Barnstable. So I first encountered this figure of justice in 1991. So 31 years ago, I was an intern at Shelburne Museum. And at that point, it was believed to be from the old Colonial Courthouse in Barnstable, Mass, circa 1774. Now known to be 1773, I do know that, but back then we thought it was circa 1774. And that courthouse was on this site and part of the building we're in right now, the remnants of which still exist in this building we're in right now. And so I had that in my head of what this sculpture was. And then even today, the current catalog record at Shelburne Museum continues to state large sculptural figure from Barnstable, Mass., and that's its object label on the wall next to it, maker unknown, Barnstable, Massachusetts. The first evidence I can find of the Barnstable collection, the connection, is from the old Shelburne Museum records from the 1950s. So if you look at the document here on the left, this is actually a catalog page from the Archives of American Art, and it's from the collection of New York City dealer Edith Greger Halpert, and she cataloged a lot of Shelburne Museum's folk art collection. And actually, Electra Haver-Webb, the founder of Shelburne, bought most of her folk art collection from that dealer, although justice was not purchased from Edith. But you see here in this document that here again, the justice once adorned the courthouse located in Barnstable, Mass. And we do know that's a 1959 entry because of the other information in it. And this possibly is an earlier, undated notice, probably done by Edith Halpert, but found in Shelburne Museum archives, also saying probably from the courthouse building formerly of the courthouse building at Barnstable. So I have these old 1950s catalog records, and then the 1960 book, The Story of Shelburne Museum, again says from Barnstable. So it was long established when I was there as an intern that this was a Barnstable courthouse figure. The interesting part about this one in the archives, it does say bought of Mr. Thompson. So before we sort of thought, oh, maybe it came from Edith Greger Halpert, but no, we now know from Mr. Thompson. And if you look at his an inventory of objects that he sold to Shelburne Museum, we can see what his full name was, Stanley N. Thompson, Burlington, Massachusetts, and here is Figure of Justice. And we know it was sold here, it was June 23rd, 1950. So this was one of the documents that sort of surfaced as we were trying to do this research. But here on this, really the original document that came in with the object, mention of Barnstable, and I can find no other letters, no other invoices, no other paperwork for when the sculpture came into Shelburne Museum's collection. So then I'm asking, so where did this Barnstable story come from? It's on the Shelburne Museum records, but not on the records coming in from the dealer. And I went to, Shelburne Museum keeps object files on all its figures and artwork. And when I was there as an intern, this was the information that we had. You'll see a 1964 letter here in response to an inquiry from Jack Johnson of Shelburne Museum to the Barnstable clerk asking about, is there any information on the justice figure here in Barnstable? And at that time, it was thought to have been on the 1770s courthouse building here on the cupola, and the reply was all those records before 1827 were destroyed by fire. So that was a dead end at that point. But then again in 1971, the Historical Society of the town of Barnstable responded to an inquiry that they couldn't find any real documentation, any written documentation, but the oral history was the story that I think we all now know, that when the old courthouse was built in the old Colonial Courthouse, built in the 1770s, that the justice figure stood on top of that. But when the new courthouse was built in 1832 and the old building was sold, that by the 1840s, when the Baptist church bought it, they renovated it. The justice figure was no longer appropriate to the Baptist church. It was no longer wanted, and a workman or a carpenter took it, sold it, and at some point it ended up at Shelburne Museum. So that was sort of the oral history that had come down with the object for years and years and years. But the object file also contained a lot of 1980s articles about her from Shelburne Museum as a clipping service. So any time a Shelburne Museum is mentioned, the clipping comes to them. And it really wasn't until these 1980s articles that anything was in print that I could find. And in 1981 is the first cod line of the Barnstable Patriot mention of it I could find. And that's when it's retelling the story of the carpenter taking it after it was discarded and later selling it. But it's this 1982 cod line entry that's of special interest, because I think it might be where the story started. So it says, a friend of Mrs. Perry's family, very friendly with the founder of the Shelburne Museum, is said to have told her the story. So the story about justice. So, my question is, well, Mrs. Perry, first of all, is there any relatives here? She was the assistant county law librarian, Lois Perry, and the article called her a student of things historical about Barnstable. So whoever this friend of Mrs. Perry's family was, is how that story might have originally ended up at Shelburne Museum in their records. And then that little article goes on to talk about when the courthouse was restored, probably in 1951, I told the county commissioners about the situation, so about the justice story, and they contacted the Shelburne curator to see if it was possible to obtain it again and put it on this courthouse or inside on display at the present Superior Courthouse. They were refused. So here is, again, this 1950s retelling of the story. So I think perhaps this is when it gets into the Shelburne Museum record. So that's what was known. When I left Shelburne Museum in 2001, it was this oral history story, but no one could find any documentation. So I got back to that spiral of revisiting Justice's history in 2018. I was doing research for a book. So Jean mentioned the book I was working on. It was a book on weather vanes for a former curator at Shelburne Museum, Robert Shaw. So he was working on researching the weather vanes for this book and for the exhibit that Jean mentioned at the American Folk Art Museum. Here's the cover of the book. I started the research for him in 2018. He'd started it many years beforehand. It was finally published in 2021. But this research for him brought me to Waltham, Massachusetts, to the Waltham Historical Society, because he wanted me to go through some surviving journals of a Waltham weather vane maker, L.W. Cushing. And here you can see, here's a broadside when Cushing was in partnership with Cushing and White. So the weather vane company started in 1867. He actually bought out somebody else. The company itself had started in 1852. But this weather vane companies, they were making copper weather vanes and doing a lot of advertising. They had circulars, they had broadsides like this, and here's one of their products, a copper weather vane of Dexter, and you can actually see his drawing right here, a depiction. So these things, broadsides, would be shipped around the country to advertise to different agents to try and sell their wares. So I'm going through the Cushing materials, and I come across trade cards made by Cushing and White. So businesses often made these trade cards as a further advertisement for their products. And I'm looking, first of all, it was amazing to find photographs of these objects because a lot of times it was just those drawings that we had depicting them. So here I am, I'm going through the trade cards, I'm seeing, oh, you know, we totally know this fox, and here's one of their banner weather vanes, and we know this squirrel. Oh, here's an unknown weather vane specialized for Buffalo Park. I'm going through, and then I'm like, so I see this, and literally, okay, so I'm going to get to this in a minute, but I'm going to say your spine tingles. My spine just tingled, even seeing it again. And so here is me, okay? I am researching at Waltham Historical Society. I'm working for Bob Shaw, who's hired me to do this. And this is my spine tingles again. So if Bob hadn't been a curator at Shelburne Museum, if I hadn't worked at Shelburne Museum, would we have matched these two figures? Would we have, you know, known the connection? Because here we are. Here is this trade card from second half of the 19th century weather vane company advertising this emblem of justice. And here is the wooden figure of justice. And you can see it is incredibly similar. So you've got the same drapery, the same ball, and if there's more pictures, but you'll see later. So this trade card read, emblem of justice, made for Courthouse at Delaware, Ohio, number 78, 144 inches high, weight 100 pounds, gilded $300. And the reverse was information about the company, which is also interesting because it's the later name of the company. A lot of these trade cards, they put on the later company's name. So here I have this card, and this form, we know it was made by them, it's their trade card, wasn't on any of their circulars, wasn't on any of their flyers or posters or broadsides. And even this number 78, so they assigned a number to each of their patterns, each of their weather vanes. By at least 1872, that number 78 was assigned to a rooster weather vane. So this was the only visual record that has been found that associates this figure with this Cushing and White company. But there is written documentation in newspapers and also in those journals of L.W. Cushing that I went to research. So he kept a journal with a few surviving years up to 1871. They end about March 1871. And he does mention the justice figure. So at first I'm going through, these are journals, you know, I'm trying to interpret the scroll and figure out what he's saying. And I'm just transcribing, I'm just writing it down. So in 1869, I write down February 23rd, letters to B.H. Willis. I didn't know any of this at the end here, right? And so I find this, and then I find March 27th, all letters to these three gentlemen. So what happens is later I find newspaper accounts that tell me who this B.H. Willis is. He's the agent through which this emblem of justice was sold to the courthouse in Delaware. So when I go back to look at the journals, I'm like, oh, there's that name. So he's the agent. And then I also knew that this was their New York City agent, this was their Concord, New Hampshire agent. So here's Cushing sending out letters to these agents, you know, trying to get business. You know, what do you want to buy? You know, will you buy our goods? Buy our goods. And then here on June 11th, I came across Eureka. We got the order for the figure of justice today, 7.5 feet high, to go to Delaware, Ohio. So I could tie that with this. I knew the order came on June 11th. And then on June 21st, this was even a bigger deal, he says, in the PM, I went to Boston to see Mr. Hastings to cut the figure of the goddess of justice. And I see this name, and he's actually already been established by Myrna Kay and other weather vane historians that Mr. Hastings is actually E. Warren Hastings, who was a ship's carver. So all those years when people thought, oh, this, you know, could be, you know, the carving is the quality of a ship's carver, you know, it's just this incredible piece of artwork. It was indeed carved by a ship's carver, E. Warren Hastings. This Hastings carver had already carved a figure of Gabriel, a small weather vane, flying Gabriel, for Cushing and White, and then he would later carve a sheep. So he was carving other things for Cushing and White. But the fact that the order came in here, and then he goes to ask Mr. Hastings to cut it, to carve it, suggests that this figure was definitely made to order, that it wasn't a form or a mold that they already had, so it was not pre-made. And then the journal goes on, these 3 July visits to see Justice, presumably at Hastings' workshop, which was on Commercial Street in Boston. So July 8th he goes in, July 19th, and then July 29th he goes in with Still, who's Stillman White of the partnership Cushing and White. So I've got them visiting it. And then here, on August 2nd, figure of Justice photograph. So now I know when this was photographed, 1869, August 2nd. So this is all establishing what date this figure is from 1869, and here's the exact dates of its creation. And then August 7th to Boston to see to the getting out a figure of Justice. And then August 9th, here's where hard to decipher the handwriting. It probably says out since it said out up there, but figure of Justice out today. So she was finished. And then this group of September entries. So this is, I'm just showing you, these are my tidbits, my little pieces of bread that I'm following on that spiral of trying to figure out what's going on here. And this, I mean, this was over years. You know, tonight it's taking, 20 minutes. This was over years. I see that they're going to Boston about a room in the Mechanics Fair. September 11th, spent most of the day at the Mechanics Fair trying to get room for our veins. September 13th, spent the day in Boston putting up goods for the fair and Free, who's Freeman Hodgson's brother-in-law, still with me. September 14th, I went to Boston, met Still and Free, and put up the Goddess of Justice. And then September 15th in Boston was Still and Free putting up the veins at the Mechanics Fair. So I'm like, what is this? And so I dived into those last 3 journal references. So they're putting up the veins, they're putting up Justice, and this Mechanics Fair. And so the Mechanics Fair refers to the Massachusetts Charitable Mechanics Association and the exhibitions they held. So these exhibitions, they promoted the mechanical arts. And these exhibitions offered the opportunity for these artisans to showcase their work. The award of an MCMA medal was really a recognition of excellence that was important both to the people who received it, but was very widely respected by their peers and by the public at large. So they're putting up at the fair the veins, they're putting up Goddess of Liberty, and this just sort of gives you an idea of the displays. So each company would have an area and they would display their wares and their goods. There was photographs, there was, a whole range. There were farm instruments, there was artwork. In fact, that Hastings, who's the carver, he was the judge some years at the fair for art. So I had the journal entries, and then I was able to find, and this is just, you never expect to find these things. At the American Antiquarian Society, they actually had a catalog and journal from that 1869 fair. And it does list Cushing and White, and with their entries, copper weather vane and emblematic signs. And we do know from the trade card that Justice was called Emblem of Justice, so she was an emblematic sign. But I was like, okay, I still don't know. Like, was she there? She was put up. Can I find any newspaper accounts? And so going through, this is hours and hours of research. But then I find in the Boston Post, September 16th, 1869, describing that 1869 fair at Faneuil Hall and Quincy Halls. And it describes the rotunda of Quincy Hall as where the exhibition vies in brilliancy with Faneuil Hall. A gallery has been run around with 4 faces, and from the east and west sides stand forth 2 gigantic carved figures, one of Justice with her sword and scales, and one a figurehead representing an Indian chief. So here's the carved Justice, which makes me, sure that it was this Justice, the wooden Justice. But it would not have been this wooden version that was sent to Delaware, Ohio, to be exposed to the elements. It would not have survived for long. That's also where the hypothesis that it was up on the top of the 1770s Old Colonial Courthouse fell apart too, because it would have been demolished by the winds and the weather. So this wooden figure at Shelburne Museum is in fact just the pattern from which the copper version was made for that Delaware, Ohio courthouse. And so presumably they probably followed the same steps they did with the weather vane. They could have followed some of the steps. So first a wooden pattern would have been made, like they did for all their other weather vanes. So she was the wooden pattern. And then from that wooden pattern, they sent her to a foundry, would send the weather vane to a foundry where molds are made, these iron molds, so that copper could be hammered into them to form each part of the piece. And there was a mold for each leg, each side of the leg, and you have all the pieces here, and they would be soldered together to make the whole. So that's how they were approaching weather vanes. So that's probably how they thought, oh, we're gonna approach this figure of justice. And in the Cushing journals, a lot of the weather vane wood patterns were taken to the Henry N. Hooper foundry to make those molds from which they made their weather vanes. And these molds allowed multiple copies of each vane to be made. If you had a wood mold, erode over time, whereas the iron molds, you could hammer sheet after sheet of copper into it. It's all very much tedious handwork because those copper sheets can break so easily. Here you see somebody, you just have to be very careful with, hammering with this is a modern day reproduction of what would be done. But these are actually 19th century molds from another New York company, E.G. Washburn, that actually ended up in Boston as well. But these molds survive, as do, let me just show you this. So here is, just to give you an idea, so half of the horse was made in here, the legs are made in these littler molds, and then the two sides are soldered together, all the little pieces of legs to make the whole. And then back in the day, this all would have been gilded or painted, so you wouldn't see the seams. So these molds survive, these E.G. Washburn, as do a group of Cushing and White molds that were found in the 1950s by Edith Gregor Halpert, that same dealer who cataloged Shelburne Museum's folk art collection. But the molds for this justice were not recorded with that group, and no other copper version of justice is known. Now, Cushing's journal the journal never does make an entry about taking justice to the foundry to have the molds made. So we're not absolutely sure that patterns were made and molded to then hammer the copper into. It could be that the copper sheets were put over the figure and then hammered on top in a relief mode. That's just a possibility. That would really, though, hurt the wood. So did this indeed, intended just to be a one-off for the courthouse? We would assume if they wanted to make more of them, they would have made molds. Or did they just consider this wood pattern disposable? These are still questions we have, and I think, a good examination of the object today, maybe we could further, investigate to see if there's any evidence of copper being hammered over it. So at this point, I had the carved statue at Shelburne Museum with references in those journals that was carved by E.W. Hastings. I had the trade card in the collection at WHS that indicated it was for the Delaware, Ohio courthouse. So I knew the last documented location of the carved figure was 1869 at that mechanics fair until it was sold in 1950 to EHW. But then I was like, okay, well, let me track down the courthouse version. So here you see, this is the one made out of copper. So she was the pattern to make this copper version. And do take note, you'll see the difference, see the pinky here? And you'll hear about that in a little bit. And the journals do make reference to her journey to here, to the top of the courthouse where she still stands today. Cushing noted in December 17th, 1869, to Boston to see about shipping the figure of justice. And then on the 18th, we packed the justice and made ready to ship Monday. And that's when I went to Delaware, Ohio. that end of it, and there are so many newspaper accounts of her making her journey across the country. There was a tornado back here, supposedly, which I'm still investigating. There was a snowstorm along the way. She got there, she was delayed, and it was in those newspaper accounts that they named B.H. Willis as the agent who sold the figure to the courthouse, and that's how I associated with the journals. And in fact, the newspapers, the Delaware, Ohio newspapers, only mention Cushing and White as the Eastern firm, not even by name. But they do say once it got to Ohio, they sanded and painted it, and it describes its large gilt ball, 2 feet in diameter, and that it was made of sheet copper. So we know it was made of sheet copper and finished in a stone color. So originally it would have looked like a stone sculpture on top of the building. And the articles did say it's said to be only one of its kind in the Union. So that supports, okay, was it never made again? And it described the sword and the balances were gilt, and then it cost $320. So that's $20 more than the trade card said. So I don't know, it went up a little bit. So this photo of it, this is from the 1990s. This is after it had been painted gold. So it did not look like this in Cushing and White's time. This was from 1996. So where did Barnstable fit in? Now, we knew it could not have been on the 1770s Barnstable Courthouse, since it was only carved in 1869. But we still didn't know its location from that 1869 Mechanics Fair to the 1950 purchase by Shelburne Museum, or even how the dealer, S.N. Thompson, had acquired it. So I thought, well, maybe there's clues in Barnstable. And that in 2018, so after discovering those trade cards, that's when I contacted Jean Gwill. And actually, no, first I contacted Shelburne Museum, and in their object file, Jean had been writing to them. So I only got back on this trail in 2018, but I found correspondence with Jean with Shelburne Museum from 2014, trying to figure out where did they get this story from Barnstable. He could not find anything out on the historic records side here in Barnstable. And so that's when we came together and sort of melded our two sides of the investigation. So I think, Jean, you guys got at it from trying to sort out the building and the evolution of this building, and trying to see how the old Colonial Courthouse bones were inside of here. And if you all have not watched the videos on the website of Tales of Cape Cod about the building and the evolution of the building, I highly recommend it. They are amazingly informative and so well done, and you can learn so much. So I've really enjoyed learning a lot about this building from that. But pertinent to my research on Justice figure was this 2016 architectural survey done by Tales of Cape Cod. And in it, as they addressed the possibility of Justice being on the courthouse, it stated, "As it stands, there is nothing to connect the statue to Barnstable except for the Shelburne Museum entry." So still, there was no written documentation here in Barnstable or anywhere else. So by the time I got back to Justice in 2018, I had found out that the Tales of Cape Cod had already found no proof of association between Justice and Barnstable. There was no newspaper accounts, no documents in the archives. And then they had actually examined the figure and had New Bedford Whaling comment that it looked like the sculpture was from after 1830, and New Bedford Whaling, with all of its ship's figure carvings, really, understands sculpture of the 19th century. And then, remember when I said, look at those fingers, how the difference was? Jean was also told by Shelburne Museum that the fingers, or he discovered in some historic photos, the fingers were gone when it first came to Shelburne Museum, and now they've been replaced. So that's why that pinky is no longer sitting up in the wood version at Shelburne Museum. So all these pieces sort of make sense. Like, it's not from 1770s, it's from later in the 19th century. The hand's been replaced, so the only thing that didn't exactly match the other images. So here I have the information about the history of the carving. Jean and Tales of Cape Cod were approaching it from one direction, and we came together to really figure out what we now know. So that's where it takes a village. Never hold research to yourself. Put it out there, and you will learn so much more. So where would justice, let's just go back to the hypothesis, where would justice have even been displayed if it was in Barnstable? Even, if it had escaped the written record, where could it have been? And the Tales of Cape Cod have already determined what was inside all the cupolas of the old colonial courthouse and even the new. But just in revisiting, that 1770s hypothesis, we know that there was a bell inside the cupola, so it was not justice. And this Gustavus Hinckley remembrance of what the courthouse looked like, it clearly has a banneret weather vane on the top, which is very typical of 18th century courthouses of the time, was a banneret weather vane. It was not until the end of the 19th century when our figure was made that it became customary to have a figure of justice on courthouses. So you may ask, could justice have been on the current courthouse? But we know that this bell was moved over to that courthouse when it was finished, so it wasn't inside that cupola either. But that bell, the Captain Adolph bell, was replaced in 1873 by the present bell, made by N. Hooper and William Blake and Company, Boston, Mass., and it was made in 1872. So here is one possible connection between Cushing and White and Barnstable, only in that this is the foundry that made their weather vane molds. So could there have been, at the time this bell was made in 1872, the two named partners, Hooper and Blake, had already died. But what's sort of interesting is that in 1873, when this bell was installed, another firm owner, the son of Hooper, he died. So he's dying, could possibly the wooden mold ended up back at the foundry and then somehow through that bell transaction ended up in Barnstable. I mean, this is wild speculation, a long shot, since the Cushing journals do record all the goods from the fair coming back to their shop, but perhaps it's just one opening. But this one is another. So later, I don't know how many, not much after this research, Jean contacted me about another Tales of Cape Cod project about replacing the weather vane on this building as it stands now. In 1905, when the tower was put up, this weather vane was assumed to have been installed. So when this weather vane was purchased, which we can't tell exactly the form, but it is a style, many of the weather vane companies were making similar forms, similar styles, but here's another wild speculation. Could this be a Cushing weather vane? So in 1905, the firm was still around. White had left the firm, but L.W. Cushing was still continuing it with his sons, and he was still alive. He didn't die until 1907. So when this weather vane was purchased by the church and made its way, could justice have been sitting in the Cushing workshop all these years and come down with the vane? But still, where's the written documentation? Like, it's such a noteworthy figure that you would think there'd be some record of it somewhere. But these are like the next two items to pursue to see if it's a possibility. But fundamentally, this is all we know about this wooden sculpture. That we know it was received from an order in June 1869. It was created in 1869, so, no 1770s existence for it. It was exhibited at that fair, and then it was sold in 1950 to Shelburne Museum. That's really all we can say in cold, hard facts. So was the figure ever in Barnstable? So although, we're saying the old colonial courthouse provenance is debunked, could have come in with that bell or with that weather vane? If so, where would it have been exhibited in the town or around? Where would it have been? You would think there'd be some notation about it. And lack of newspaper written account seems to suggest it was never here, but we're still looking. And then my curiosity is, where does the story of justice's association with the old colonial courthouse originate? So who was the Perry family friend who told the story to Electra Webb, the Shelburne Museum's founder? I would love to get that side of the story. And then I'm still trying to find out there's some association of that dealer, Thompson, who sold it to Shelburne with Barnstable. As of yet, I can't find any family ties. And then my biggest concern is where was justice from 1869 to 1950? I'm trying to follow up on the firm's other patterns, the other wood patterns. Several were acquired by that Halpert, that dealer from Chelsea, Massachusetts, another dealer in the 1950s, he was still making them to look old in the 1950s, so she got a whole bunch, but none of that justice was not known to be in there. And could justice have maybe gotten, could Thompson, that dealer, have gotten justice from that same dealer? So these are still the questions that are still swirling around that whirlwind of trying to do research. So really, fundamentally, all we can say is we can scrap this label. Here's where she stands at Shelburne Museum. Scrap that. We now know the maker was E. Warren Hastings, made in Boston, Massachusetts. We know it's carved for Cushing and White, and for the copper sculpture from this wooden pattern is on the Delaware, Ohio Courthouse. So that is really all we can say for certain, but I'm hopefully tonight will spark new interest to find some facts, some cold hard facts of where it could have been located from 1869 to 1950. And if anybody has information on that weather vane or the bell or any family accounts, I'm thinking we can't find in the newspapers diaries, letters between family members, anything that make it noteworthy. Because when you think of how much press the copper sculpture got in Delaware, Ohio, and even we have sculptures at the MFA that it's a big ship's figurehead that sat on a piazza in New Hampshire for years. And it had so many articles written about it. When it blew over in the storm, they'd write an article. And if anything happened to it, they were articles. So I'm just hoping one of you tonight can continue on this search with me, and we will find more facts and get to the bottom of it. So thank you so much for your patience and listening. And we'll do questions at the end, because I'm sure there will be a lot. So,
thank you.
Jean, you're up.
The second story that we would like to explore is the story of Iyannough. Iyannough was the Sachem, or governor, of the Matakees. The translation of Matakees from the Wampanoag into English is long pasture, a term that we continue to use today. Iyannough's lands stretched from Sandy Neck in the north, all the way across the Cape to Hyannis, from West Barnstable to Yarmouth. The width ran from West Barnstable to Yarmouth. And many of the old writings refer to the area around Cummaquid as Iyannough's village, implying that that was the base of his operations. That was the base of the tribe, basically around Cummaquid. Most of what we know about Iyannough comes from Mort's relation. This is a journal that was written by Edward Winslow and William Bradford, starting in November of 1620, when the Mayflower landed in Providence, and concluded in November 1621. It was published in London in 1622. The Pilgrims had two encounters with Iyannough. The first occurred only 7 months after the landing of the Mayflower. One of the settlers, the child of one of the settlers, became lost. He wandered away from the colony in Plymouth and was lost in the woods. They searched for several days and then received word from the Wampanoag that the boy had been discovered, that he was safe, but he had been given to Aspinet, who was the governor, the Sachem of Nauset. So he was taken from Plymouth or Manamet all the way across the bay to Nauset. There was no explanation as to why that occurred. The Pilgrims organized a rescue party of 10 men and set out in their small boat, their shallop. They got as far as Cummaquid on the first night and decided to come ashore. Well, they anchored in the midst of the bay and to quote them, where it was dry at low water, which is familiar to all of us that know Barnstable Harbor. In the morning, they spotted 2 Wampanoag catching lobster in the bay. Their translator went to them and learned that the boy was in fact safe, that he was in Nauset, but they encouraged, the Wampanoag encouraged the Pilgrims to come ashore and have dinner. I quote from Mort's relation, "They brought us to their sachem, or governor, whom they called Iyannough, a man not exceeding 26 years of age, but very personable, gentle, courageous, fair, and conditioned. His entertainment was answerable to his parts, and his cheer plentiful and various." After eating, they departed for Nauset. They arrived late in the day. Iyannough and 2 members of his tribe went with them. Iyannough and the translator from the Pilgrims, Tisquantum, went to find Aspinet, the sachem of the Nauset, to explain the purpose of their visit. A short time later, Aspinet appeared with 100 members of his tribe, and one of the tribal members was carrying the boy on his shoulder. They delivered the boy to the shallop, and Aspinet, to quote, "Aspinet made peace with us, we bestowing a knife on him, and likewise on another that first encountered the boy and brought him to this place." The Pilgrims were concerned about the safety of the colony because half of the men were on this expedition. So they decided to leave immediately to go back to Plymouth. Along the way, they ran into bad weather. They had to go ashore to get fresh water. Again, they encountered Iyannough. And I quote, "Iyannough took them and searched in the dark a long distance to find drinking water." And I quote again from Mort's relation, "In the meantime, the women joined hand in hand, singing and dancing before the shallop, the men also showing all the kindness they could. When Iyannough returned, he took a bracelet from about his neck, and hanging it upon one of us, by God's providence, we returned home." That was the first encounter with Iyannough. The second encounter occurred approximately 10 months after the Pilgrims landed in Provincetown. After a disappointing harvest and the failure of supplies to arrive from England, the Pilgrims faced almost certain starvation. They turned to trade with the Native Americans as the only source of food for the winter. Under the direction of the leadership of Bradford, the Pilgrims set out on a voyage across Cape Cod Bay, again in their shallop, and down the outer coast to Monomoy. At Monomoy, they went ashore and were welcomed by the Native Americans, who refreshed us with stores of venison and other supplies. Returning to Cape Cod Bay, they traded for corn and beans at Nauset, Camaquid, and Monomet. When they dropped anchor off Camaquid, they were again warmly received by Iyannough, who gathered as large a supply of provisions as his people could spare. Through the combination of their success in trading and inhospitable weather, the Pilgrims were forced to leave some of their bounty behind. Bradford asked the Native Americans to protect their provisions until they could return, adding that if the provisions were found in good order, they would, quote, take it as a sign of their honest and true friendship, and if not, they would smart from their unjust and dishonest dealings. Early in the new year, the Pilgrims returned to find that the Wampanoag had kept their promises. They were able to retrieve their provisions and bring them back to Plymouth. In spite of the friendly dealings between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag on Cape Cod, relations began to deteriorate. One of the underlying reasons was food. The Pilgrims did not have provisions, and the Pilgrims probably went to great lengths to steal or to obtain food from the Indians. The frictions were exacerbated by key individuals, unpleasant dealings, threatening encounters, and eventually friendship and mutual support quickly deteriorated into mistrust and suspicion. In the spring of 1622, the colonists decided to take action. Led by their military captain, Miles Standish, they attacked and killed several warriors from the Massachusetts tribe north of Plymouth. The head of the slain leader was put on a stake and brought back to Plymouth, where it was placed above the fort in the barbaric custom of the English. Words of these events so alarmed the Wampanoag of Cape Cod that they feared for their lives. They deserted their villages and ran to the swamps and remote islands, fearful of returning to their villages, fearful that that meant certain death. They were unable to plant their crops that spring and that summer. By late summer, they started to die of hunger. In the following months, almost every sachem on Cape Cod perished. That included Conacoom of Manomet, Aspinet of Nauset, and Iyannough of Comaquid. According to Nathaniel Philbrecht, before Iyannough died, word reached Plymouth that the young sachem said, "The God of the English is offended by their actions. He will certainly destroy them." Iyannough died in the winter of 1623. Fast forward, in May of 1861, two farmers were plowing a field in Comaquid, and they came across a brass kettle. As they retrieved it, they realized that the brass kettle was actually on top of the skull or skeleton of a Native American. Beneath the right arm were artifacts of mortar and pestle. Beneath the left arm were more artifacts, a bow and arrow. And beneath the skeleton was an iron hatchet. It was decided that these remains must be Iyannough. This argument, or this position, was supported by two arguments. Number one, this was in Comaquid. This was Matakees. This was the land where we are certain that Iyannough entertained the pilgrims. The second is that the brass kettle and iron hatchet were English. They were not part of the Native American culture. So the earliest that they could have been obtained would have been 1614, when the coast of Massachusetts was mapped by John Smith. Soon after the time of Iyannough's death, the Wampanoag of Cape Cod adopted the practices of the English settlers and ceased to bury individuals with their personal riches. So the decision was that this must be Iyannough. The skeleton and the objects, the artifacts, were given to Pilgrim Hall and put on display in a glass case. Writing in 1961, Louis Cataldo stated, "The evidence upon which they were pronounced Iyannough was so conclusive that the officers of the society did not hesitate to so designate them." I was able to find the description of the skeleton that was used in Pilgrim Hall. It said, the remains are those of an Indian and evidently a chieftain. Governor Winslow writes that Indians, when they bury their dead, they sew up the corpse in a mat and put in it the earth, and put it in the earth. If the party be a sachem, they cover him with many curious mats and bury all his riches with him. Note, there is no mention of Iyannough in that description. On Cape Cod, the significance of Iyannough and the significance of the remains discovered in 1861 continued to be celebrated. In 1894, the Cape Cod Historical Society placed a slate marker on the gravesite, where it remains today. In 1957, Tales of Cape Cod purchased 7.9 acres of property containing the gravesite to protect it from development. There are a number of familiar faces and names in this picture. This is a rededication picture, and I was unable to get any more information, but I understand that there's only one person remaining in this picture that is still alive, and that person is with us today. Would you please raise your hand? Rich French. Thank you. Rich was 14 years old when that picture was taken. Tales of Cape Cod has maintained a special relationship with the Wampanoag tribe over the years. Following the purchase of the property, Tales of Cape Cod has permitted the Wampanoag to reinter remains of ancestors that were uncovered by natural erosion, shifting sand dunes, or construction activities. In 1985, there were 11 reinterments. I think this picture is from 1964, I believe. In any case, if you just extrapolate, it's entirely possible that there were over 100 reinterments on the property in the time since Tales of Cape Cod purchased it. Meanwhile, back at Pilgrim Hall in the early 1970s, the curators of the museum decided to re-examine the remains of the Wampanoag chieftain that was thought to be Iyannough. This re-examination determined that these remains could not have been Iyannough because the remains were those of a female. In 1974, the remains and artifacts were repatriated to Frank James of the Wampanoag tribe of Awtrey. Finding the skeleton that was thought to be Iyannough was in fact the skeleton of a young female raises several questions. Who was this female? And what was she doing in Iyannough's grave? Seriously, it raises the fundamental question of to what extent has the white man, the newcomer to the Americas, imposed his biases on the history of the past 400 years, especially the history of the Native Americans. Returning to our story, there were three questions that I wanted to answer. What happened in the early 1970s to cause the Pilgrim Hall to want to re-examine the remains? Second, why were the remains and associated objects repatriated to Frank James, and who was Frank James? Has anyone in the audience heard of Frank James? Thank you. Frank James was born in Chatham in 1923. His parents were descendants of the Wampanoag of Gayhead, or Awtrey. At age 14, he chose the name Wamsuta for himself as homage to the eldest son of the Wampanoag chieftain Massasoit. In 1948, James became the first male Native American to graduate from the New England Conservatory of Music. While many of his classmates were recruited by the top symphonies across the country, James was denied employment because of the color of his skin. He returned to Cape Cod and became a very popular music teacher at Nauset High School in Eastham. Frank James first attracted national attention in 1970 when he was invited to participate in the 350th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims. Prior to the event, the organizers asked for a copy of his prepared remarks so that they could publish them with the other speeches. Upon reading James's speech, the organizers deemed it inflammatory and unacceptable. They revised the speech and sent it back to James. He refused to deliver the revised speech and disinvited himself from the ceremony. On the day of the 350th anniversary, James descended on Plymouth with hundreds of Native Americans and their supporters. They declared Thanksgiving a day of national mourning for Native Americans. James's suppressed speech was relatively mild and passive by today's standards. It is with mixed emotion that I stand here to share my thoughts. This is a time of celebration for you, celebrating an anniversary of a beginning for the white man in America. It is with a heavy heart that I look back what has happened to my people. History wants us to believe that the Indian was a savage, illiterate, uncivilized animal. What has happened cannot be changed, but we must work toward a more humane America, a more Indian America, where men and nature once again are important, where the Indian values of honor, truth, and brotherhood prevail. James devoted most of the remaining years of his life to fighting racism and fighting for the rights of Native Americans. He died in 2001 at the age of 77 and is buried in Chatham. From 1974 to the present, the gravesite property has remained in the ownership of Tales of Cape Cod. As far as I am able to determine, public awareness of the site and the story of Iyannough have declined over time. Today, Tales of Cape Cod realizes that the property is underappreciated, misrepresented, and misunderstood. We desire that this property should be used to increase the knowledge of Sakam Iyannough and the history, culture, and lifestyles of the Wampanoag people. Our plan is to create an open sanctuary, open space sanctuary that will be available to the public. We are currently in discussions with the Massachusetts Audubon Society and the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe to connect the gravesite to the Long Pasture Trail Network, to place one or more interpretive markers on the property that will explain the story present the story of Iyannough, his interaction with the pilgrims, and increase public awareness of the Wampanoag people. We also intend to update the interpretation given to the human remains that were discovered in 1861. This project is currently in its early exploratory phase. We are working with Mass Audubon and the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. We recognize that if we're able to do this, that it will create further opportunities for the three organizations to work together to increase awareness of the Wampanoag people and to collaborate on educational and cultural events. That concludes my comments. We've run over in time, but I'm sure if there are questions, we can take a few. Any questions? Yes?
You talked about reinterments, but I didn't understand, were they from the Courthouse site or to the Courthouse site?
In general, from Cape Cod, anywhere on Cape Cod to the Comaquid site. So in the case of construction activity is probably the primary culprit here that would unearth remains. And given how the Cape has grown in the post-World War II period, it's not surprising that there are a lot of them.
So there are multiple burials now on that site?
We know that there are multiple burials, multiple reinterments. They are in unmarked graves. Yes?
Dean Parent and I have done some research on the pilgrim, and when you talked about the first association with Iyannough was when he found the Colonial boy, and you postulated as to why he would be returned to the gospel. And we think it was because the pilgrims had been accused perhaps right result of stealing the corn from Cornhill. That was Aspinall's territory. So it perhaps was to bring him back to justice where the corn was taken from.
Did,
At that time also, Bradford made good on his promise to return, to pay recompense to whoever used the corn. So that made me like it to the hospital.
I had heard that interpretation, that it's a stretch to find a young boy in Manomet and take him all the way across to the other side unless there's a purpose. And the only thing that we're aware of is that the Pilgrims did in fact steal corn from the Nauset and upset the Nauset by doing so. And it was a time for the Pilgrims to come clean with the Nausets, basically. Yes?
So the Wampanoag is like the umbrella, and then we've got the Manakees and the Nauset, and they're the sub-tribes under them.
Yes, and that's right. Are there any questions of Sloane? John?
Yeah, and Sloane. Could you just clarify the size of the statue that you saw?
Oh, yeah, so she's about 10 feet, they're about 7 and a half, 10 feet. This one's taller because it's got the base, but they were 7 and a half feet was the original.
So, I understand, so the wooden statue matches in size the statue that's on top of the Delaware, Ohio
Yeah.
courthouse.
Exactly, in size,
I
yeah.
thought, I was not sure about the 10
Yeah.
versus the 7.
Right, so I think, originally there was no base. We call them 10 feet now. I don't know. I think it's just, there's been a lot of sizes, but it's basically the same size, the same form, the same folds, the same sword, all the rest matches up.
And do you think there's an infrastructure inside the statue with no iron? Because
So-
just the copper form by itself, I think that would last a few years.
So Cushing and White, for their weather vanes, actually patented a interior structure for the weather vanes, and I'm sure they sort of, reinvented that for inside that sculpture as well. So there was like a support structure inside.
Thank you.
I know in the picture there was like a horse, there was like a modern day showing the copper ring.
Hammer the copper.
Yeah, here in copper. Was the wooden statue hollow?
So this is where the weather vane hypothesis that was made exactly like the weather vane sort of falls apart. Like, I think she was definitely the pattern for the courthouse statue. But I do not think, like, for the weather vane patterns, they were, I can give this up, the weather vane patterns were carved in one big piece of wood, but that bigger statue was made up of little pieces of wood that were glued together. So that sculpture could be broken apart to make those iron molds out of. But when you look at her, she doesn't seem to be in all the pieces. It's like a weather vane horse. It was split down the middle, excuse me, each leg was separate to make those, excuse me, to make those molds out. And then later, all those wood pieces, after the molds were made, were brought back together, glued back together to make the sculptural form. Yeah.
Did they make many weather vanes, or are there many weather vanes this big?
No, so they advertised they made weather vanes and then these emblematic signs. So she would have been considered a sign, an emblem. They did make trade signs like mortar and pestles that would have been, pretty big for the size of the building. But 7.5 feet is probably one of the largest projects they did. And that could be perhaps why there was never another one made and why this one wasn't made exactly like the weather vanes. And what's interesting, I didn't include it in the list of journal entries that refer to justice, but even earlier in 1868, Cushing has an entry in his journal that says Stillman, White, the partner, was full of contrariness about the goddess and justice. And so maybe there was a little disagreement, should we be embarking on this sort of endeavor? And it's all supposition, these letters that Cushing was sending to that agent in Ohio, was he suggesting the form? Where did the idea for it come from? Was it the agent talking to that courthouse, the members there, and they're the ones who said, well, let's have them make this emblem of justice for us? So that's another, the C.H. Willis agent guide, see if there's any
I think
records.
we have one more question.
I'm curious about making the iron forms using the wooden molds. How did you, or not you, but how did they prevent damage to the wood carving itself?
So the wood carving, it'd be molten, and then the sand, somehow they take the wood carving and they, put it down in the sand. And then somehow the concave of the sand, they make the impression of that, and then that was used to make the iron molds. I'm not good on all the technology of it.
So they didn't actually put the iron,
Right, no.
the wood in the
Right.
molten iron.
So it was like a
That's why-
foundry making sculpture today, so the artist puts in their their clay model, whatever, and then that concave of that model, the form's made, and then through silicone, whatever now, but then through that impression in the sand, or whatever it is, of that object, from that, the iron mold's made.
Thank you, and special thanks to Rich French for revealing himself as the unidentified youth. Please join us for refreshments in the meeting room.
Thank you.